It's Sunday, I'm feeling spooky, and today I wanted to share more of your ghost encounters. This time, we're specifically talking about seeing ghosts at work, which I think is just incredibly interesting. For anyone who's new here, hello, my name is Hearth. I really enjoy talking about witchcraft as well as ghosts, and a few months ago I opened up a form for all of my subscribers so that they could share their ghost encounters for these videos. If you'd like to be involved yourself, the link is in the description box. The only requirement really is that the stories are accurate and true. Now, as mentioned, this week we're primarily talking about ghost encounters while people are at work. And this is really interesting to me because the majority of ghost encounters happen when there's very few people around, usually at night, usually in your own home, or they will occur in a haunted location. It's quite unusual to be having ghost encounters in broad daylight, though of course it does happen, and it's also quite unusual for people to have haunted experiences when they are very busy doing other things, because usually you're distracted, you're working, you're interacting with people, you're perhaps less likely to acknowledge the things that are happening around you that perhaps are more spiritual or spirited in nature. And so when I hear stories, especially of people at work, I'm always immediately drawn in because I'm thinking, this is going to take a lot of energy to be able to get to this point. Now, the first one was submitted by Denise. Now, Denise actually sent me a couple of stories, so I'm going to split them between episodes so they're in and among stories that I think they'll work best with, but this one in particular is really interesting. Before I retired in 2020, I worked at Royal Stoke. That's a hospital. We used to have a mobile MRI unit outside the old assessment unit. There are 2 wards in the assessment unit, to the right and left of a kitchen, and the wards are locked with card entry systems. I was in the kitchen one day. I'd say it's about 9 foot square, filling a flask from a hot water boiler mounted on the wall. I heard someone come into the kitchen behind me, but I didn't turn around to look because I was filling the flask and didn't want a burn. After a second or two, I'd finished, put the lid on, turned around and found the room empty. I hadn't heard the person leave. The ward doors hadn't unlocked, and the corridor leading straight out of the kitchen was empty. I was a bit surprised, but didn't really take much notice. 2 weeks later, I was back again and went to fill my flask. While I stood waiting for it to fill, I saw a grey shape in my peripheral vision enter the room and go past me. Then I heard the microwave ping twice. I had the sensation of someone looking at my back, you know, when you feel a bit goosey. Anyway, I turned and the room was empty. I saw a cleaner further down the corridor and asked if she'd seen anyone go into the kitchen, and she hadn't. The other thing is, that microwave only pings once when it's finished, but I definitely heard it ping twice. Both times I heard someone enter the room, but I never heard them leave again. I can honestly say that I wasn't frightened, but more bemused. The amount of stories of weird stuff at Stoke was legend. So many staff members had their own paranormal stories, and I suppose it's maybe not unexpected in a place built on the site of an old workhouse, and where life and death are in close proximity. A former advanced practitioner nurse, Terry Setterington, co-wrote a book on paranormal Stoke-on-Trent, which includes some of her own experiences. While some of the facts in the book are slightly incorrect, I don't doubt her own stories. 2 of my colleagues, working in the MRI unit, both saw a man walking into the scan room, something that is absolutely forbidden for safety reasons, and both of them ran into the room to get him to leave. But the room was empty. They both were adamant that they saw the same man at the same time. The whole department could be creepy, especially late at night. Cleaners have heard children and seen handprints on the windows they've just cleaned in the imaging waiting area. Now, hospital stories always go straight through me because there is something so deeply unsettling about hospitals. I no doubt respect people who work in hospitals day in, day out. I couldn't do it. I find the atmosphere so unsettling. I find it always feels like someone is watching me every time I go into a hospital, and I'm just not sure how I feel about it. But it does make total sense. We often find increased spirit activity will occur for several different reasons. Maybe I'll have to do a video on just this topic if anyone's interested. But it can be because of things that were on the land before, in this case the workhouse, which I will touch on in just a minute. but also heightened emotions as well as traumatic events and sudden deaths. And what do you often get in hospitals? You get a lot of trauma and high emotion happening. This might be physical, this might be emotional. You also do have, sadly, a lot of deaths in hospitals, some of them expected, some of them not so. And when you have all of that combined, that can lead to a heightened environment for energy and also a lot of spirits. And so hospitals do tend to have a reputation for being incredibly haunted. And because staff are there 24/7, you tend to find that during the quiet periods, I'm not convinced hospitals ever get truly quiet, but when they are quieter, you almost always have someone present in that space. So there's not really anywhere for the spirits to hide if they do manifest at certain times of day. Now, there is some debate as to whether the spirit activity comes from people who have passed over in the hospital, or whether it is the heightened environment that happens within those hospitals that kind of attracts spirits in. But in this case, I almost think I'm leaning towards this being someone who has worked there in the past. It's very clear that this person or this spirit in question, whether they're human or not, is very aware of the environment and also very aware of the way people would come in and come out. Now, a lot of hospitals in the UK tend to be fairly old with newer extensions, so it may well be that this particular area is considerably older than some of the newer parts, and so it might have remained the same for a long period of time. So you might have had someone who worked there 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago who will still recognize the layout of that building, because what will commonly happen when we have ghosts walking through walls is that if you were to look at the floor plan of a property, say 100, 200 years ago, you may well find that where the ghosts are walking through the walls was actually once upon a time a door, and it's only been changed recently. So this range of encounters here is making me think that this unit might be a little bit older, and perhaps the layout hasn't changed very much. And so if you've had someone that's worked in that hospital in life, if they were to then be wandering around that hospital, they would still know where everything is, the doors are where the doors are, and the walls are where the walls are, and they're very used to it being there. And the fact that the microwave was pinging does make me think that this may well have been a previous staff member who is perhaps still running through their regular routine. You may well find that other people have had the same experiences at the same time of day in the same room, as this spirit is just repeating its activity. Now, when people refer to workhouses, this is a very British thing. I'm not sure if workhouses were everywhere. I suspect probably not. But especially during the Victorian period, workhouses were set up as a place where people who had nothing could work and have housing. Now, that might sound really lovely, right? But they were really, really horrific places to be. You would in some cases be safer living on the street exposed to the elements than being in a workhouse. Children, women and men commonly were separated from one another, so if you went in as a family, you would be put into different accommodations and you would often be working long hours with limited safety, and so you find a lot of people did die from working in the workhouses. And then you also had the problem of people were in very close confines. Disease often spread rapidly. And so while a family might go into a workhouse, you might find that only 1, 2 members of that family would ever make it out again. So while the idea of a workhouse was probably meant to be quite beneficial, the actual outcome of a workhouse was not. And so when workhouses ceased to be, the land and the properties were often recognised as being incredibly haunted, whether that was because of the trauma of having families ripped apart. I mean, in some cases, a mother wouldn't see their child for years, perhaps until that child was old enough to be moved from the children's section to the women's or men's section, for instance. The trauma of having families ripped apart, as well as injury and long work hours and potential illness and death, makes these very, very heightened spirit locations. And when you've got all of that combined, you are bound to have a lot of spirit activity. And I actually have a lot of books that cover hauntings in hospitals, and the Royal Stoke is one that is mentioned a lot, and it's probably because of this like layered energy. The next story is one that is very close to my heart, not because I know anything about the story, but because I love the National Trust. And the individual who submitted this story works for a National Trust property. Now, just to preface this for anyone who isn't already aware or doesn't follow my Instagram and sees my obsession with the National Trust, it is an organisation that helps to protect historic buildings. Now, this is different from the English Heritage, which primarily protects ruins. The National Trust works on houses that are essentially livable, and they often contain large amounts of furniture and paintings and sometimes clothing that is dated to the time period, and in some cases actually comes from the original property, and it's found in the information with the house, say like of people buying expensive pieces of furniture in the 16th or 17th centuries. Those same pieces of furniture are kept in the house and they are preserved. Now, with that being said, they need to be able to preserve the house, and so often from October through to about March, the house is closed for the winter. Sometimes they'll have Christmas events on and the like, but they'll usually close so that they can do any maintenance on the house, any cleaning, any additional protections, and in some cases it's to limit how much heating is required in the house, because the increase in heat and then the dropping to cold temperatures can sometimes damage the structure. So that's just a little bit of additional context if you aren't already aware. I work at a National Trust house. Following a period of major building work, which was naturally very disruptive to the fabric of the house, the property reopened to visitors. After a very busy season, we closed the house for its winter deep clean. One day, I was working with 2 colleagues alone in the house. All was peaceful as we were carefully cleaning the objects when suddenly we heard a really loud bang from the floor above. We knew that we were alone and were naturally worried, as it sounded as though a large piece of furniture had been pushed over. Cautiously, we ascended the stairs, and halfway up, the temperature suddenly plummeted. The house was cold in the winter, but this was an uncannily quick drop. We were starting to feel really scared at this point, and jostling with each other to walk at the back. We walked into one of the rooms, and a candle holder was lying in the middle of the floor. There was absolutely no way this could have fallen, as it has a pin which slots into the wall holder. Also, it was far into the room, and if it had fallen, it would have been much closer to the wall. We quickly put it back and ran downstairs. For the rest of the afternoon, we heard multiple crashes and bangs, but were too scared to investigate. When I checked the next day, nothing was out of place. But when I returned to the office, our environmental monitoring system corroborated the extreme temperature drop on the stairs. All was quiet again for a while, and we reopened to visitors. I was helping with the morning clean and heard what I assumed was my colleague walking up the same stairs. I listened to her footsteps on the floorboards and sensed her enter the room. When I turned to speak to her, I was alone. She was actually on the other side of the house, and no one else was working that day. I was very frightened, but also curious. Apart from some corner-of-the-eye phenomena and a strange smell of geranium in another, apparently haunted room, the house seems to have settled down. However, only last week, I was taking up some carpet in the same area to expose the original boards when the light started flickering. I think it was the previous owner making sure I did a good job. Now, this one is super duper fascinating to me, mostly because I love the National Trust, and I've seen quite a number of strange things in some of the properties. Now, for even more context, National Trust properties can range from Tudor, sometimes earlier, all the way up to 1920s, 1930s, sometimes 1950s, 60s. They do have the Beatles house in Liverpool as one of their houses that they do protect. But when we're looking at really, really old properties, that's when we start seeing a lot of haunted activity, because often it isn't one person that's died in the house or one person that's gotten ill. It's not one owner, it's actually dozens. And especially when we're looking at very influential people, it often gets passed around quite a lot. So essentially what would happen is when someone very wealthy would die, the person who took on that house would have to pay death duties. And the problem problem with death duties is it was very, very expensive. And so we see the wealth in families starting to diminish, but the death duties are still just as high. And so different parts of land were sold off to different people who then use them for farming or for building on. And then the property itself often ends up being passed through dozens of hands as people slowly start running out of money. They can't maintain the upkeep, so they give it to someone else. They can't maintain the upkeep, so they give it to someone else. And eventually the National Trust takes it on. So often these houses don't just have a couple of people that have lived in them. They've had dozens of people from dozens of different families who've lived in them. And we're also talking about time periods where medical treatment was not what it is today, not even a fraction of what it is today. So we have a lot of women dying during childbirth. We have a lot of sickness rife, especially if we're talking about very contagious diseases, things like tuberculosis. It could literally destroy a family within a home. And so you often had a lot of what would now be considered very treatable medical conditions leading to people's deaths, which then increases the rate of death in these properties. And so a lot of them do become very, very haunted. There are several that I've been to where I've not known them to be haunted, but I've seen shades, I've seen phantom cats, I've had rooms where I just do not want to enter them because they just seem so weird. I've had, especially Tudor properties, where I've seen partial apparitions, light beings, shadow beings, not shades, like actual, like, it's different than a shade. Almost the same, but definitely different. Movement, creaking, shadows changing places, flickering lights, you name it, you're probably going to see it at some point in a National Trust property if you spend enough time in them. And so this one is just so interesting, and it actually leads into what I mentioned earlier on about how there's lots of things that can trigger haunted activity or ghost encounters. And one of those things would be building work. If not complete building work, then refurbishments, adjustments, tweaks, repairs to original structures. I've even had it in my own house. My dad did some work in the basement. Before you know it, my entire house is haunted with spirits that usually live in the basement who were really, really pissed off that we drilled into a pillar. And it took going downstairs and apologizing to those spirits to get them to stop. And I'm not talking like little things moving. I'm talking people walking up and down my stairs. I'm talking people growling in ears. I'm talking people standing right outside of a bedroom door and you can sense that they're there and you can hear them breathing outside the bedroom door. Just drilling into a stone pillar caused that much of a reaction. So you can imagine what it must be like for locations with this much energy to have serious renovation and maintenance work done on them. It can majorly turn that energy upside down, and spirits that would usually be quite dormant are suddenly quite active. They want to know what's going on. They want to keep an eye on things. And I do think that your assessment here may well have been accurate, of that this may well be previous owners or at least previous property tenants checking in to see what's going on. Like, what are you doing to my home? Because a lot of the time, especially the older properties, were commissioned by the family. They were there for the building process. In some cases, they might have been a part of that building process. It is deeply connected to them in a way that modern builds simply aren't. You know, now if you want to buy a property, you might buy it off spec. You know the house you're going to get, but you're completely hands off for the project. You aren't integral to that project existing. You are simply the purchaser of it. But when you've got people that are commissioning, in some cases, very, very beautiful, very expensive properties, they're hands-on and they're going to want to make sure that what you're doing to that property is accurate. And especially when you've had a lot of this disruption happening, it wouldn't surprise me if that first candle holder that came down was them saying, don't forget that we're still here. Why are you doing this? Because it must be really confusing, especially if you've lived in a property your entire life and then your entire afterlife too, to suddenly see it change. So this one is just so cool. And then we have that temperature system corroborating everything, which I just think is incredible. So in a lot of the rooms, they will have temperature sensors and they will also have light sensors. And this is so that any tapestries, any paintings, any carvings, or perhaps murals on the walls aren't going to be damaged by increased light levels. And it also means that any textiles are not going to be damaged by increases and decreases in temperature. So they try to keep everything as level as possible to reduce the amount of damage. And they're monitoring it all of the time. You'll have like moisture level checkers. You'll make sure that there's no insects or pests that are going going to be damaging anything. Everything is monitored very, very closely. And the fact that you can corroborate what you all felt with the actual temperature evidence, absolutely incredible. Like, that is bonkers to me. So I would love to know, anyone, if you work in a hospital, please feel free to send in your stories. You don't have to tell us which hospital. You don't need to tell us anything about yourself. I just love the idea of doing an episode on haunted hospitals. And if you work in National Trust properties, have you also experienced something similar? Maybe you were a volunteer. Maybe this is something that happened 20, 30 years ago. Maybe you're actually a staff member and this is something that you experienced last week. I would be super interested to know. Just do bear in mind, you don't have to give any kind of personal information. I'm fine with just like very anonymous stories. And then we have the last story of today, which is by Five-Tailed Dragon. Now, this is one where it's kind of a different setting again. So we've gone hospitals, we've gone historical building. Now we're talking about a farm. And in this case, it is quite an old farm. Hi Hearth, it would have been around 2014, 2015 when I had what I believe to be a ghost encounter. I used to have a weekend job working on a farm near where I live. It's in West Yorkshire, so it's full of history, with old mine tunnels running under it, and very old, almost run-down buildings in some corners of the farm. I still visit there now and again to see the family, and always find it a very spooky place to walk around at night. I heard stories when I worked there of ghostly figures who would supposedly walk across the main yard, dressed in Victorian clothing and transparent, and seemingly unaware that they were dead. Another story the farmer's grandson told me was that he would see ghosts simply sat in random places on the farm and described them as being transparent, white, and misty. He claims he used to chase after them when he saw them, but whether he was just joking around or not, I don't know. For me personally, I saw something I couldn't quite explain away, even though I attempted to do so several times, even running tests to try to disprove what I saw. I was walking from the farmhouse down a hill to a small valley where there was a dry stone wall that I was going to repair. I'm idly looking around at the fields and over at the farmhouses to my left. There were 3 houses on the farm, and the farthest, on the end of the row, was where the farmer's daughter lived. I'll call her Carol for privacy reasons. I'm walking down the hill and look over to Carol's house, to what would have been her dining room window, and saw a man stood there, staring out, seeming to be watching me as I walk across the field. He looked to be around 35 to 45 years of age, bald head, wearing what looked like a red vest, with his arms crossed, as if looking out of the window at the view to pass the time, or as if waiting. After a few moments, I turned around, where he stood, arms still crossed, and walked back away from the window and into the darkness of the house. He looked like another farm worker I knew, and assumed he had simply been watching me. I thought he'd just be in the house talking to Carol about something or other, so I went on to the wall down the hill. A couple of hours later, I came back up the hill and met with Carol and others on the farm for lunch. We were going over to her house, and I noticed that her boyfriend's pickup was missing. Not unusual, since he would have been working off on site that day somewhere. But I knew Carol would have been working out on the farm all morning with the others, so the house should therefore have been empty all morning. I recalled that it seemed strange, since I thought someone must be in the house because of the man I saw at the window. Going up to the house, I assumed maybe someone else was in there which Carol knew about, only for her to unlock the door and fetch something from inside. There was no vested man, no mention of visitors to the farm. The man who I thought the figure wasn't on the farm that day either, which I expected him to be, since he was a regular worker there and wouldn't have just popped in for a morning visit. I'm aware there was time between me seeing the ghost and going back up to the farmhouse, maybe a few hours or so perhaps Carol really did have a visitor. But I think back, and I don't recall seeing her boyfriend's pickup there that morning. So maybe Carol would have been the only one to have let this person in for whatever reason, but she would have to break off from her morning duties to do so. A lot of things still don't add up. Carol never mentioned having a visitor, and the person I thought the figure wasn't on the farm. I walked past the same window on the same route several times over the coming weeks, thinking it could have been a trick of the light or glare in the window, but the window was just normal. The dining room empty and no one staring out. So who was it? I kept this mostly to myself for a long time. My sister knows the story, but those on the farm don't. While it isn't evidence for the figure being a ghost, I'll add that I remember the man in the window had this feel to him, in the way he stood and stared, with his hands crossed, gazing out at me. He looked peaceful, like he was minding his own business and looking at the scenery. I don't remember him waving or making any facial expression towards me, but I was maybe 100 or so meters away and he was behind glass, so it was hard to tell his features. I suppose, in hindsight, when I look back, it definitely feels like it was supernatural. Like the sense of it was there, but I couldn't quite pick up on it at the time. But I can now. I think they say that many ghosts simply walk among us, and we don't notice because we think they're just people walking in the street. I felt this was something which happened to me that day. I definitely still question it now, even as I write this. There's not much evidence to go on, I know, but it's definitely something unexplained that I can't quite put my finger on. If you made it this far, thanks for reading my story. Thank you so much for submitting it. This is one of those where I actually think the majority of ghost encounters are almost exactly like this one, where you walk away from it and you go, oh, that was really weird, but maybe it's not what I think it is. You know, it's almost mundane, but there's something about it that just feels a little bit odd. Now, I think the main thing to emphasize here is I know that a lot of my viewers are in America, where a lot of farms are quite modern in nature, but especially here, we have a lot of very, very old farms. So these farms might be Victorian, Edwardian, they may well be considerably older. The buildings are often very old, the dry stone walls are often very old, farm buildings in general are often very old. They have been passed down through family members, so it's quite commonplace to find a farm being 8th generation in the same family. Like, that's not uncommon. And there may well be objects on that farm that are as old as the farm itself, that have just been kind of squirreled away in back rooms or little storage areas. And so when we're looking at farms like this one, there's a lot of history in this place. And it is like layered on top of one another. So it really wouldn't surprise me that there might be strange sightings, phantom visitors, because a lot of the properties are likely going to have seen, as mentioned earlier, a lot of life and death, a lot of misfortune, sadness, sickness, joy, happiness, merriment. Like, there's going to be a lot of ranges of emotions there. And so it may well be that what you saw was actually someone who had resided in the house before. I mean, sure, it may well have been someone that was invited into that property. But this sense of they are looking at you but they don't see you is so commonplace when it comes to ghost sightings. The idea that they are looking out at this farm the way they remember it. They don't see you there. They could be looking straight at you. And yet they would have no idea that you're there, because to them, they don't realize that they've passed on. To them, they're looking at it the way it was when they were alive, might be repeating the same patterns, or they might just be popping back in for a visit. That happens quite a lot. Not all ghosts are resident to that area. Sometimes ghosts are transient. They'll pop back in, have a look around, see how people are doing, and then they'll leave again somewhere else. They might be traveling from location to location, or they might simply be coming from the other world into our plane and then back again just to see how everything is. You may well find that this person has actually been spotted previously, many times over, but people often don't want to talk amongst themselves when it comes to things like this, because they're scared that someone might take it the wrong way, or that they might make a joke out of it or belittle you for it. Like, there's a lot of stigma around ghost stories even still. But there is definitely something to be said about people walking past spirits and not even realizing that they are a spirit. I actually had a ghost encounter very, very much like this. Also, in the middle of the day. This was not something that happened in the middle of the night. I visited an old cemetery. I suppose technically it would be a graveyard because it's attached to an old church. And I really like going into this graveyard. I've been there many, many times. It's just a really nice environment, but there's definitely activity there. And up until this point, I had always sensed one particular spirit. not a very nice spirit, I've got to admit. So I was walking the path and I was seeing if I was going to pick up on this spirit again, because I often do when I'm in this same graveyard. And I walk past a tree. So a tree is to my right and there's gravestones and headstones all up the bank to my right. I walk past this tree and I see a man crouching with flowers, putting them on a grave. And I think, oh, that's really sweet. You know, someone is coming to tend to what are very, very old graves. In most cases, we're talking like mid-1800s. Like, these are not new graves. So I'm thinking, you know what, that's really nice. You know, he's coming to tend to a family member's grave. How lovely. A lot of these graves do get left kind of unloved because all of the family members themselves have also passed on. So I spot this man in like a trench coat, like a grey trench coat. And then I look back at where I'm walking and I turn back again, gone. He's completely gone. The way that he would have to get out would be to walk towards me to the path to be able to rejoin the path. He would have had to have been walking in front of me, turned off, walked up towards the graves, and then he would have to walk down the path towards me again to leave. Or he's had to step around all of these very, very old gravestones to get out, like, over the graves, which I thought was quite unlikely because these gravestones aren't small. They're like 3.5, 4 feet tall. So this isn't like an easy to step over gravestone. And I looked around, sure enough, no one there. It rejoins the road on the other side, so I'm looking along the road, there's absolutely no one there. No one else saw the man either. I wasn't even there alone. I just spotted the man, and then all of a sudden, gone. Just like that. And if I hadn't have looked again, I would have had absolutely no idea that that person wasn't physically there. And also, just to add like the cherry on top, there were no flowers on the grave where he'd just been. So I saw the man in a grey trench coat with yellow flowers and he went to put them on the grave. I turned around again. He was gone. No flowers, no man. Weird. But in passing, I could definitely have continued on with my day thinking, oh, isn't it so sweet that there was an older man who was leaving flowers at one of these really, really old graves. I would have just thought that he was an actual physical flesh and blood person. And yet, he wasn't. So you are definitely not alone in this story. And I'm sure that many other people listening to this will have had similar experiences where they may well have encountered a spirit, but it was so, so close to being a flesh and blood person that they didn't think anything of it. So thank you so much to anyone who has submitted their stories. Thank you to the 3 who have submitted their stories in this video. If you have any stories that you would like me to share in these videos, do follow the link in the description box and submit your own. I'm always interested in learning all about them. I hope you're staying safe. I hope you have a marvelous magical day. If you know anyone who would enjoy these spooky ooky videos, feel free to give it a share. And if you have any additional information, opinions, inputs on any of these stories, do let us know in the comment section. So with that being said, I hope you're staying safe. I hope you have a marvelous magical day and I will see you in the next video. Bye!